joining online. I'm very glad to announce that we have Laura Patsko and Katy Davies here, who will give themselves a good introduction now. So thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you very much, Becca. Thank you very much to the British Council for hosting this. We're really honoured to be finishing off the series for this year. My name's Katy and I teach full-time in Dubai.
And my name's Laura and I teach full-time here in London.
So we both teach in multilingual contexts. Our classes, we have many different nationalities. So our students represent a particular use of English. That's to say that English is not their first language, and they do not all share a first language. English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option for our students. So that's to say that we often talk about EFL, English as a foreign language, but in our context, if you have a German student speaking to a Japanese student, well, who is the foreigner in that context? So when English is being used as a contact language in this way, this is actually the most prevalent use of English in the world today. Non-native speakers vastly outnumber native speakers, and increasingly few interactions actually involve native speakers nowadays anyway. People teaching here in London, you may well have multilingual classes, and this may ring true for you. And it may be easier to observe this phenomenon if you have multilingual classes. Hello to everybody joining us online. Thanks for getting involved. If you're joining us online, it may well be that you have a monolingual class, and in this use of English may not be so immediately clear to you. But just because you don't see your students using English as a lingua franca in your classroom, it's not to say that this isn't actually how they use English perhaps in their work. And even if they don't use English in this way now, perhaps they will in the future, and that's what the numbers show, is that they will be doing so. If the assumption has always been that we wanted our students to interact with native speakers, or we assumed they were going to interact with native speakers, but if we're challenging that now, then this presents some interesting new challenges for us as teachers. And pronunciation is the main factor in that. Jennifer Jenkins is an important name in this area, and some of you may be familiar with her name. And she did research into what causes communication breakdown, and she took examples of communication breakdown in her classroom and looked at what was behind that. And pronunciation was the biggest factor as compared to the grammar, vocabulary. Pronunciation was the biggest cause of breakdown of communication. So we'll be looking at pronunciation today. And we'll be looking at ideas from our classroom. These are practical ideas. We're both teachers, and these are ideas that we've used and tried and tested, and we hope that you can take something for your classroom. So we're going to look at 4 areas. The first area is how to prioritize. How do you know what to prioritize in an ELF context? And then adapting your standard classroom practice. One of the main messages we would like you to go away with is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is about tweaking what you already do in order to think about your students' needs. And then we're going to look at ways you could supplement what you're already doing. And then lastly, looking at raising students' awareness, raising their awareness of the responsibilities of the listener, raising their awareness of variation. Obviously, Richard talked about that before. And raising awareness of areas of high risk where communication might break down. So over to Laura for the first part, talking about prioritizing areas.
Just before we do that, I may need to speak quite loudly as something's just gone wrong with my room microphone. People at the back, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. People at the front, am I deafening you?
For the camera?
No, my camera mic is fine. So I'll just shout at you. So we're going to start looking at priorities for an ELF context. As with any class, with any area of language, we would suggest that the best place to start is with a thorough needs analysis. And by this we mean 2 main things. One being discussion with the students. So just simply knowing your students is always a good rule of thumb, knowing why they're learning English, and particularly who they are communicating in English with. As one of the key principles of English as a lingua franca is that it's more important to consider who is speaking to whom than where they are. The other part of the needs analysis then is diagnostic work. So listening to your students' pronunciation and identifying any potential gap between their current intelligibility in an ELF context, or their likely intelligibility, and the intelligibility which they need. And we're going to talk in a moment about how you judge that. If you've spoken to your students and you've determined that ELF is a more realistic way of looking at their use of language than English as a foreign language, for example, then in the multilingual classroom, you have a ready-made ELF environment. Your students are already using English together as their lingua franca, and we've found that one successful way of identifying how intelligible they are in that context is through a basic dictation exercise, but one in which they dictate sentences to each other. So the format you're probably familiar with in terms of a teacher leading dictation, but here the judges of intelligibility are fellow ELF users. And one way that it's very simple to set this up is by using sentences which are already in your course book, if you're using a course book, typing them out a little bit bigger and spacing them out so that you can cut them up and give one to each student. And then each student is responsible for reading their sentence to the others who need to take that sentence as a dictation. As an example, these are some sentences I've used from a course book recently. You can see they're standard type of sentences you see at the beginning of a unit, designed to start discussion on the topic. I used them not initially for vocabulary or discussion work, but as diagnostic sentences for my student-student dictation. And the idea is that the students have time to prepare their sentences, but that I don't set any kind of context beforehand, because when they're taking the dictation, I want them to rely entirely on sound, not on top-down guessing of meaning from context. So I can get as close as possible to simply what they hear and what sounds they produce. While they're doing that, I take notes, and they look a little bit crazy like this. When I first did this, I didn't anticipate showing it to a room of people and potentially people online. So these notes are from me, and I'm just scribbling down things which I notice as they speak about anything to do with pronunciation, whether I think it's relevant to ELF or otherwise, but anything that stands out to me, which I think will help me inform my analysis later. And the thing I've circled in blue here is an example of something which I anticipated being a problem and was a problem, I realized later. And two things in red to show you that there are also things that turned out to be problematic later, which I hadn't anticipated. So this is a wonderful exercise as a learning tool for me as well, because it makes me challenge my intuitions about what my students need or don't need in order to be intelligible, particularly in an ELF context, because English is my first language. And that means that I have a little bit of work to do to appreciate how it is to be a second language English user listening to another second language English user. You can see the students' notes are also a little bit messy. And you can see from the sentence at the top what they've done to prepare themselves before they speak. So I let them mark anything they think would be useful. In this case, the student has marked where they would pause while they were dictating to help the other students take down those words. Sometimes they also make a note of words they think they would have difficulty pronouncing particular sounds in. And you can see that I've circled here things which I discovered later were a problem. The one circled in red here, originally the word was remind. Several students heard it as remain. And the beauty of this is that when I collect their papers in afterwards, I can see how several students had the same difficulty, so I can work out what they have in common. Another example of a student's work here. So once you've got all this data about what your students have produced and what they've perceived within their ELF context, within that multilingual classroom, you need to kind of apply an ELF filter. Again, assuming that you have determined that their goal is to be intelligible in a lingua franca context. And fortunately, such a filter exists. Some research was done some 13 years ago that Katy mentioned by a woman called Jennifer Jenkins, who some of you have probably heard of. And she devised a list of features which were shown in her data to be absolutely crucial for intelligibility in a lingua franca context. The list is quite long and a little bit, it takes some time to get your head around the details and how it would work. So just to summarize, there are 5 key areas. Most consonant sounds were included in the core, and again, it's called core as these are essential for intelligibility. There's room outside the core for other features of pronunciation, which might give the speaker an accent, as we may commonly term it, but it wouldn't break down communication. So most consonant sounds are in that core. Consonant clusters are also very important to be preserved. So words like street, the s-t-r at the beginning, it's quite important in ELF to make sure that that is maintained. One vowel sound, and it's the vowel in words like bird and word, it's the sound. The other vowel sounds, their quality was not considered crucial to intelligibility. Vowel length, particularly before unvoiced consonants. So the concept that the vowel in a word like hat is very slightly shorter than the vowel in a word like had. And nuclear stress, which is to do with where the stress falls in a thought group or a word group. So in a sentence like, let's visit your mother next Saturday, that would contrast in meaning with a sentence like, let's visit your mother next Saturday, because the stress is placed in a different location. And especially where used for contrast, that was seen as crucial for intelligibility in an ELF context. Applying this to your classroom, the techniques really don't need overhauling. The way that you normally teach pronunciation if you're aiming for English as a foreign language or aiming for your students to approximate a native-like accent, such as received pronunciation, as Richard spoke about, you can use the same techniques if you're aiming to improve intelligibility in ELF. Drilling, simple drilling of sounds and developing the automatic nature of pronunciation. Minimal pairs, particularly important in ELF for some contrasts like the vowel length distinction, hat, had, and so on, making sure the students can recognize them and produce them. Basic discrimination exercises, like I said, with a difference in meaning between let's visit your mother next Saturday and let's visit your mother next Saturday. So training your students to recognize those differences in sound and to produce them. And awareness of the articulators, really important for all pronunciation teaching. But particularly in ELF, one of the key principles is the concept which Richard touched on earlier, that accent is flexible and people modify their pronunciation and they do it in a number of different contexts for a number of different reasons. And in a lingua franca context, speakers of English might well be interacting with a vast, with a wide variety, of different pronunciations of English. And the ability to be aware of how sounds are produced and how to modify your speech is really, really valuable. Based on all of this data and applying your filter, you arrive at a syllabus, a list of things to prioritize for your classroom. If you teach in a multilingual classroom, this can be a little bit more difficult to do than if your students all share the same first language, and if you share that first language, as I don't know about you, but I don't speak all of the first languages of all of my students in a multilingual classroom, so finding what they have in common poses a challenge, and this is a challenge that I attempted to address when I did some research in this area and devised a piece of material that helps you see what the students have in common across 12 different first language backgrounds. That resource is available on our blog, and there's a link to that on your handout. So Katy is going to move on now to talk about your classroom practice in a little bit more detail.
Okay, thanks, Laura. So just a quick show of hands, how many people use a course book that is imposed on you by your institution? Yeah, so would you say over half? Yeah, maybe about half, yeah. And I guess some people online as well, you also have these institutional constraints using a course book. That's my context. We use New Cutting Edge for all the levels for our general English classes. So you've done this great needs analysis that Laura explained, but then you've got this course book. So how do you marry the two? And actually, it's not so difficult. You've got this filter that Laura talked about, this lingua franca core. And so if you sit down with this list and sit down with your course book and look at what's in there, you can then sort of think about what you've already got at your disposal to work on those areas that are key for ELF intelligibility. But you need to have a bit of a critical eye when you're looking at this. Some of the pronunciation exercises, or that are labeled pronunciation exercises, it may be that you think, okay, under the lingua franca core, this is not essential for intelligibility. In fact, it may be damaging. Some things like, for example, the word can. I don't know about you, but in my course book, there's bits where it says can is more appropriate than can. And so these weak forms is something that course books often focuses on. If you're looking at ELF intelligibility, that would be considered actually detrimental, make you less intelligible if you say can instead of can. But you don't need to get rid of it totally, because perhaps that'd be useful to improve students' listening, working on their bottom-up listening skills, and receptively, they need to be able to decode that. But do we need to be drilling that? Do we need to drill into our students can instead of can? And it's about giving students choice. And that's what ELF is all about, is actually thinking about your needs and giving learners the ability to make informed choices. And so those are kind of crucial ELF moments that often come up in the class, where students might ask which is more correct. And then you can talk about the notion of correctness with them and say, okay, but which did you find easier? When you were listening to those dictation activities that often come first in a pronunciation exercise, did you find that easier to understand when they said can instead of can? And if not, then perhaps think about your context. So my students in Dubai are speaking to all different nationalities. So we're saying to the students, do you think that it would be easier for someone to understand you this way or that way? And then it's up to them to choose what they think is better. So having a critical eye and thinking about receptive or productive, is what do we want to focus on? Some activities have multiple aims, and sometimes the aims, you may want to focus one part receptively but the other part productively. It's possible to still use the exercise as it is. You don't need to then retype it and eliminate the part that is only for receptive purposes. For example, stress, talking about weak forms, stress and unstress. You don't need to be drilling the schwa in order to work on the stress. Under the lingua franca core, stress, nuclear stress, is key for intelligibility. But these are often combined in coursebook exercises with weak forms. But you can still focus on the stress part and just leave the weak forms to one side. It doesn't mean you need to get rid of the exercise altogether. It's just thinking about why you're doing it, what your aim is. The last thing to think about when you're looking at your coursebook is the phonemic chart. Often this is used within the coursebook, and it's something that which you're probably familiar with in your classes, and it represents a particular accent of British English that Richard's touched on earlier, RP, received pronunciation. And so this could be problematic if students and teachers perceive this as a model. And as Richard said, this is not a model, but it is a useful tool. And the way that I've been using that in my classrooms is to help students to put all those different spelling patterns under one symbol. You were talking earlier, some people, about spelling. I think you're over here, we were talking about spelling. I work in a context with a lot of Arabic speakers, and spelling is really important for me to work on in my classes. And they found it really useful to see this chart as a whole lot of symbols that mean they can put all these different patterns under one symbol and collect them all together. And it's about consistency. You were talking about how do you say it, and it's about having consistency so that if somebody is listening to you, they can switch a parameter and they can say, okay, this symbol here, this person pronounces in this way, and if it's consistent, they can then recognize that again and again and again. So just to show you a few examples, this is an example of a syllabus that I made for my elementary class. So on the left column, we've got including productively, so things I get students to actually do. On the right, we've got included receptively. And in the middle, maybe include, because we've got word stress, which is still a bit of a grey area, and there's still research going on in that area at the moment. So again, it's thinking about students' needs. If you've got a class where some students need to operate in an ELF context, but some students do need to assimilate within a native speaker environment, well, then you know that the things on the right include receptively. You could then direct your students to that productively if their need is to assimilate within a native speaker context. And I've had that before. Just like with anything else you do in your classroom, if you've got a student with a particular need, take 5 minutes, quickly speak to them, set maybe a bit extra for homework, and then also you can even use that student to produce things that the others then listen to. So the others practice their receptive skills, and that student who needs to produce that can then practice their pronunciation productively. So it's quite possible to have students with varied needs within the same class. And we're always selective in other areas of our teaching. I think we probably will say that if we have a course book with all these different grammar items, some we might give more weight to than others depending on our learners' needs. And really what we're saying is, well, why should it be any different with pronunciation? Why wouldn't you consider your learners' needs and be selective based on that? So just to show you an example now, this is from New Cutting Edge, of what I mean about an exercise that focuses on something you could do receptively. Here you can see we've got contractions. So with exercise 1, it's a dictation exercise, really useful for practicing bottom-up listening. But in my context, my students might ask me, okay, teacher, do I say I will or do I say I'll? which one is correct? And again, you can say, well, both are correct, but which did you find easier to understand? And in your context, which do you think your listeners would find easier to understand? And then it's up to them to make that informed decision. And I've had really positive and fruitful discussions with students, and they've actually said, yeah, it sounds like you're eating your words, and yeah, I don't want to do that, and that's their choice, and I respect that. So all these kind of ELF moments really do add up. They're just 30 seconds here and there, but it does end up painting a real picture that your students feel that their needs are being taken into account, and rather than just native speaker expectations. The other thing I mentioned was the phonemic chart. Here we've got S and Sh. In my context, my students wouldn't have a problem producing Sh, but they would have a problem spelling it. You can see we've got collection with TI, fashion, SH, obsession, double S. And this is problematic in my context, is the spelling. So I wouldn't ditch this, but use it in a different way. And it comes back to thinking about your aims. What are you trying to achieve? And using this, although it's labeled pronunciation, for me, I would use this and use it for spelling. And the way I would use it is to create a grid, and then you've got the different spellings, and then students can add words into that as they come across them. And then also it comes back to consistency, as this lady said. And it just gives the impression that it's not a model. It is just a tool. So after all this filtering, you've got your syllabus and you have eliminated some parts. You should have more time on your hands to focus on the parts that students really do need to work on. But again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can still use your course book to do extra work on the areas that your students need. I'm sure that with listening exercises, we're often using the transcript to look for vocabulary, for example. Why not mine the transcript also for features of pronunciation to work on? Laura touched on nuclear stress. That's something that Laura actually wrote an excellent blog post on our blog. The link is on your handout, which fully illustrates how to do a lesson working on nuclear stress. So I won't go into that in too much detail, but you could use your transcripts in your book in that same way that she has demonstrated in that lesson. The other thing to think about is using your students as models. Richard talked a bit about models, and I think if your students have produced something that appears to be intelligible to everyone in the class, when you're drilling it, why repeat it yourself as a teacher? Why not say, okay, Ahmed, that was great. Could you say that again? Okay, everyone listen. Got it? Okay, 1, 2, 3, everyone. Okay, Ahmed, can you say it again? Everyone got it? Again, 1, 2, 3, all together. And he's the model. Why do I need to repeat it? And I think that gives out a message to students that they are also intelligible models. The other thing is to give extra time ahead of speaking activities to prepare for pronunciation. So we often give time to prepare what vocabulary or what structures students want to use, but what about the way they want to say it? And just giving a little bit of extra time and thought to how they're going to say it could also give the right message. But the other thing you could do is use authentic materials, and Laura's going to talk about that now.
So the way that we like to define authentic materials, and I hope you'll agree, is material which has been created in English, but not for the purpose of learning English. People are nodding, good. People online, I hope you're nodding. Can you just put your hand up if you have used authentic materials with learners? Okay, almost everybody, I think. What we'd like to suggest is that, again, finding video and audio is the crucial thing. Okay? This is one of the things that put me off using authentic materials as a newer teacher, is it took me so long to find things that were appropriate. I don't need to introduce you to the internet. I know you all know what it is, and you probably have a lot of favorite resources that you use for finding authentic material to supplement your course book. But we are going to show you some of the resources that we've used and found helpful in terms of exposing learners to a wider variety of pronunciations than those which they typically hear. We would start with news websites, and the key point to be made here is that, again, if your intention is to expose your students to a wider variety of pronunciations of English, then it might be worth consulting a wider variety of websites than you yourself might normally consult to check the news, for example. So it's just about reminding yourself, perhaps looking at the Times of India, is somewhere that I would not normally go to check what's happening in the world, but it might be a fantastic place to go to find examples of accents from that part of the world which my students need exposure to. Another website rather is TED, which I think Richard touched on as well. Some of you are probably familiar with this. For those of you who aren't, just briefly, it's a collection of presentations, workshops, conference, seminars like this one on a wide variety of topics given by a very wide variety of speakers from all over the world, of varying lengths. And again, it's just quite a rich resource, and a lot of the videos also come with transcripts or subtitles, which can facilitate making activities out of them. YouTube as well is a good place to look. It may seem obvious, but just if your student says to you, I don't know, teacher, I've just signed a work contract with a company in Brazil. I need to be more familiar with the speech of Brazilian Portuguese speakers. And you think, oh, actually, I know a film star who acts in English and that's their original language, or a footballer or somebody. Where can I find an example of them speaking? It may seem obvious, but YouTube is a good place to start. There are countless interviews posted there that you can use clips of in the classroom to help your students gain a better awareness of that pronunciation. IDEA, the International Dialects of English Archive, and there's a link on your handout for this, is also another good place to look for that kind of material. It's searchable by geographical region. So again, you can look for a particular place in the world, find a person in that place who speaks English, and then what becomes important is not necessarily where they are or where they're from, but who they're speaking to. And if there's somebody who your student is likely to be speaking to, then there's a clip available for you. And these clips on this website also come with transcripts and notes, which again facilitates the lesson planning process. The Speech Accent Archive is another example of that. There's also a link on your handout. This differs slightly from the IDEA website in that all of the clips are of the same text, but there are very extensive phonetic notes on how the speaker pronounced certain things in that clip. So again, that can help teachers with something of the analysis. And we've also found that there are some clips actually on the BBC Learning English website, which looks as though it's been created to learn English. Presumably it has, but a lot of the clips on there are authentic recordings and natural speech of speakers from a wide variety of backgrounds. So it's another resource that we found helpful when we didn't have a student in the class who represented a speaker from a particular language background. We've looked at some of these sources and found one quite easily. In terms of what you do once you've found the video and audio, there's a number of blog posts which Katy has written based on TED Talks, based on speakers on the BBC Learning English website, to give you an idea and some specific links, if you're not sure where to start, of ways of bringing these clips into your classroom. So I'd recommend you look at the detailed explanation that she's written there. One other thing which we would also suggest is using the script. Katy mentioned doing this if your recording comes from a course book. But if there is a script available for an authentic clip, or if you can make one, and only just a short one, we see no harm in bringing that into the classroom to help develop pronunciation, whether productively or receptively. It removes the fear of unknown words, and it gets straight to the heart of the matter at looking at how the speakers produce those words. Equally, it provides a rich resource of alternative models, other examples of proficient users of English than the teacher or even than the other students, so that your students can potentially select a kind of guide that they think, yes, that could be me, I could achieve that. That person has something in common with me, and they're using English clearly on an international level very proficiently. One example, which we've used before, is this lady, Monica Bellucci. This is the example of the kind of length that we would use of script. You can see that it's really quite short because, again, if you're aiming to look at specific features of pronunciation, it helps to keep the focus very narrow, and anything longer can be a little bit overwhelming. I don't think we have time, unfortunately, for you to do the activity with us, but what we would normally do is have, for a script like this, have the students mark where they think the speaker might pause, where natural pauses might fall, to draw their attention to nuclear stress, these thought groups that we talked about earlier. And we don't mean exaggerated pause while the speaker forgets something or doesn't know something, but a natural break in the flow of speech. And then they would listen and check. We do have time to play you the clip. It's very short, so you can hear how she says this and get a feel for the type of clip, which we found is very useful.
And to have the chance to work with different directors all over the world. And through my work, I can get in get in touch with cultures and reality that is so far away from mine. That's also why I love my work.
Okay, so you get the idea. It's very short, it's very simple. To a first language English speaker's ears, it's quite intelligible, but it's also worth raising the students' awareness that in an ELF context, a first language speaker of English is not likely to be the judge of intelligibility. Other proficient ELF speakers are. And that's where their input on whether they find the speech of a particular person intelligible is hugely valuable. They will be the ultimate judges of each other's intelligibility. So that brings us to the final point, which is one authentic material is the students themselves. And if you're in a multilingual classroom, you have an ELF environment there by definition, which you can exploit. Katy talked about having students drill clear pronunciation for the others. You could also equally record their discussions, their presentations, and use that as a recording sample for another class, or for the same class to come back to measure their progress and their clarity and help them develop their pronunciation. So use them as an authentic material as well, with their permission, of course. And this brings us on to the last point we're going to discuss in the presentation about raising students' awareness. So, Katy?
Thanks, Laura. So how many people have been in a situation where students say, oh, I can't understand his or her accent, kind of complaining about this? Quite a few, yeah, quite a few, and maybe some people online as well. And do you ever get the feeling that they really feel it's that speaker's problem and it's their fault that they can't understand? One of our roles as teachers is perhaps to raise students' awareness of the responsibility of the listener in avoiding communication breakdown, and that this is a two-way street, this intelligibility. And so what can we do to encourage this kind of responsibility? One thing is to encourage students to signal non-comprehension. So when students are trying to negotiate meaning between them, they need to show the other person if they don't understand what's being said. They might be reluctant to do this if that's their friend in the class. They don't want to upset or embarrass that person. Or maybe it's culturally not so acceptable to interrupt somebody, to say that you don't understand. But we need to make it clear to our students that the best person to indicate that there is a breakdown in communication is the other person in that communication. And we need to promote an atmosphere where that's okay to do so, and it's okay to do so maybe even the second or the third time to still say, I still don't understand. We can maybe point out to our students that if they don't do this, if they don't signal that they haven't understood, then how can their friend improve their pronunciation? If they don't know that they've got an issue with a high-risk area, thinking about the lingua franca core again, if nobody tells that person that they haven't understood one of those areas, how can their friend improve? So it's about telling them they have a responsibility in that way as well. And some people might say, oh, well, the teacher's the best person to interrupt. If you can see that, communication is breaking down, then the teacher could intervene. Okay, but the bottom line is that the best judge of ELF intelligibility is other ELF users, and so we can also convey that message to our students. Perhaps they haven't indicated that they don't understand because they don't have the language to do so, and so we also have a responsibility as teachers to give our students chunks of language, phrases, to show politely that they haven't understood. Pronunciation does not exist in a void, and a lot of work to do with ELF is going on in the world of discourse, so this kind of strays into that area. The other point to make for multilingual groups is the importance of mixing students with different students all the time. I'm sure we all do this to expose them to a range of different accents, if we've got that luxury at our disposal. And in Jennifer Jenkins' research, she actually said that it was more beneficial for students to be in pairs rather than groups, because it's easier to be faced with one different accent to yours rather than a range at one time. But what about for monolingual situations, especially for everyone watching online? That may be your situation. You don't perhaps have this range of accents within the class. And as I mentioned earlier, it may be harder then for students to imagine the ELF world that is out there. And so one thing we can do is bring statistics into the classroom to actually make students aware of that. Robin Walker's book is very useful, Teaching the Pronunciation of English as a Lingua Franca, and the reference is on your handout. And also the British Council has great statistics on their website. So if we can make students aware of the lingua franca world, then that can help. And Also to make students aware that although communication might not break down in the classroom, because the other students share the same L1, so share presumably similar pronunciation features, it may be easier for them to understand each other. But when they go outside and speak to other speakers of other L1s, there may be areas, high-risk areas, that do lead to communication breakdown. And there's literature out there to help us understand which areas they could be. But if you're familiar with your students' L1, that may be easier for you anyway. And then if we do this, it means that students, when they're in an ELF context, if communication is breaking down, it means that they can think, ooh, maybe it's because I said this word, and I know that that includes a pronunciation feature that is a high-risk area for me. Maybe that other person hasn't understood, so maybe I need to reformulate it, and they can negotiate meaning that way. So we also need to focus in monolingual groups on giving students the phrases, the chunks, to reformulate. And in terms of awareness of high-risk differences, awareness of other speakers' high-risk differences, so other language backgrounds. So like Laura talked about with bringing authentic materials into the classroom, that's really important in a monolingual group where they're not so exposed to other languages. So if you know the students L1, you're also at an advantage perhaps to talk about language variation and attitudes to variation in regards to the actual L1 that you all share. And then you can talk about how that relates to English and variation in English. Any talk about attitudes towards variation needs to be done sensitively. But I think we need to credit our students with the maturity to do so. And if we can start by talking about attitudes within their own L1 and their own varieties within that language, perhaps that can help them to see how that relates. So there's a quote that I'd like to conclude this final part with from Jennifer Jenkins. She says, "Speakers who find themselves together in an attempt to accomplish a particular task, the successful accomplishment of which is to their mutual advantage, will be instrumentally motivated to facilitate communication in order to achieve a successful outcome." So they'll be instrumentally motivated. And the focus really here is that students need to work together, they need to cooperate, but that cooperating is only going to help them both the speaker and the listener, if they work together.
So just to summarize the key points in taking an ELF approach to pronunciation, there are a few key things to remember which we'd like to leave you with before going on to questions and answers. One is that accent and intelligibility are different things. This is borne out by volumes of research. It's something that students and teachers need to be aware of. Everybody has an accent, as Richard spoke about. It's just a combination of speech sounds that you characteristically make. And it is flexible. It's not a static thing. It's dynamic. And speakers naturally vary the way that they pronounce particular words, as well as other features of their speech, such as vocabulary and style, depending on who they're speaking to, why they're speaking, and so on. Something that we need to raise awareness of, as Katy said, is that learners have a choice. No one approach to anything about language is going to be right for everyone. An ELF approach to pronunciation is no exception. Some learners may need and want to approximate a particular accent of English, which may be an accent which exists in native speaker communities, or it may be an accent which reveals some of their original identity, so to speak, their geographical origin, or anything else about themselves. And there should be some choice in determining what they're aiming for. The other thing to remember is that intelligibility is a two-way street. There are two people involved in interaction. There's a speaker and a listener. And this is part of what you would need to raise awareness of in the classroom if you don't already, but particularly in an ELF context, as there are so many more speakers and listeners involved in terms of first language backgrounds and first language influences. It is something that you need to approach with care, to approach sensitively, as the issues surrounding accent, identity, prejudice, and so on are quite sophisticated. And so you do need to be careful in how you approach these discussions. But as with everything else, know your students and talk with them about why you're doing what you're doing. And finally, and this is key, that for many students, native speaker norms simply may not be appropriate. For a very long time, the English language teaching industry has taken a more native speaker oriented approach and assumed that people using English as a second language are learning it in order to assimilate or integrate within a native-speaking community. And that simply may not be the case. Certainly, statistically, it's unlikely to be the case nowadays. And so it's just about teaching your students to handle the English language as it really is, as it's used all around the world, regardless of where you are. What's important is who is speaking to whom. And Richard talked about ownership. You cannot own a language. It's not something like a house or a car that you can say is one person's. There needs to be an element of flexibility. And it's about teaching your students to manage that flexibility. And this is an emerging area which is developing all the time. So it's really quite an exciting thing to be a part of. We'd like to finish just with one quotation from Robin Walker, again, whose book reference is on your handout, which is that to remember through all of this, even if the concept of English as a lingua franca is somewhat new to you, as Robin says, teaching pronunciation for ELF is primarily about rethinking goals and redefining error, as opposed to modifying classroom practice. So we hope that in this presentation this evening, we've given you some food for rethought in your own classroom practice. And thank you very much. Questions?
Wonderful, thank you very much both. That was fantastic and a really nice balance, some great practical ideas that I hope we can all take away. Shall we take a question in the room first? Does anybody have any questions?
You said that you teach stress and not weak forms. And that you teach things like the sound in bird. Does this mean that you don't teach diphthongs and you teach them as monophthongs? Which is what learners tend to do anyway,
Sure,
of course.
sure. In the Lingua Franca core, Jennifer Jenkins, her data showed that vowel length is really important. So when it comes to diphthongs, the key thing is the length of it. Well, in my experience, I found that when communication is broken down, it's because it's not long enough. So that's what I focused on primarily in my classroom. I don't know about you, Laura.
Yeah, the key point to be made is that a particular quality is not so important, but consistency of quality is. So it's not advisable for students to jump randomly from saying castle to castle, for example, to be consistent in the vowel quality that they choose and to preserve the length. So the length of a diphthong would be the more important thing to focus on. Does that answer your question?
So we have some questions from online.
One, two? How long?
Maybe two, and then another one in the room. Anybody? Okay. So I'll come to you first.
Shall I answer one more?
Can
you
I
have a look?
I
I'll
can
answer
suggest
another
one for
question from
you.
the room. Oh, yeah.
Go on.
So if you're sharing a student group with another teacher who has a markedly different accent than you do, how... Oh, hello. I think everyone heard that. If you're sharing a student group with another teacher who has a markedly different accent to you, how do you cope with being told, that's wrong? Because that's what happened to me before. I've been told that's wrong, and I'm like, excuse me.
I would personally, that does happen, definitely. And I would welcome that as a kind of ELF moment to talk about the notion of correctness, personally, and that it's about variation, and that, yes, that teacher does pronounce it differently, but haven't we all got different pronunciation? Think of all the different people, the footballers that you know. Do they all pronounce it the same? In your own country, does everyone pronounce everything the same? It's an opportunity to talk about variation, and to kind of maybe dispel some myths, perhaps, about this notion of correctness. Like we said with the phonemic chart, it's not a model. And it's not that is the one way that people should speak. I've got my accent and that teacher's got her accent. And I would personally say that's pretty beneficial, because if they're getting exposed to a wider range of accents, then great, because that reflects the realities of the English speaking world.
Should we take one from online? Sure. There's, shall I do one and you do one?
Sure.
I'd like to take this one as it raises an interesting point about the lingua franca core. This is from Jose online, says, imitating people with a lisp helps Brazilian Portuguese speakers to pronounce the unvoiced th. And would it work with people from other nationalities? I think he makes a good point about the fact that you can pick up on raising learners' awareness of other aspects of speech that they could, in a sense, borrow into their own speech, even if it doesn't come from a source you might normally think of as a place to borrow a sound from. However, that particular sound, th, and the related sound, the, were excluded from the lingua franca core, as the data suggested that pronouncing those sounds with sounds that are commonly substituted, like f and v, never damaged intelligibility. And when my students tell me that they prefer to use English as a lingua franca, they're not trying to approximate a native speaker accent, and they cannot for the life of them pronounce th, I say, don't try so hard. That's not your goal, and it probably won't damage your intelligibility in an ELF context. If you find it easier to substitute th and v, that's okay by me. And it will probably be okay by the people that you're speaking to.
Yeah, could I just add to that as well? Because I teach a lot of Arabic speakers, and Egyptian Arabic in particular, it's a z pronunciation. And yeah, similarly, I've had students say, you know, is this correct? And it means we can talk about correctness. But I've never seen communication break down in my classroom because those speakers say z instead of th or the.
I think this is also what's rewarding about knowing that there is some kind of data, and the data gathering is ongoing, which gives you a kind of guideline, because we very often rely on intuitions to respond to these kinds of questions from students. And intuitions can be fantastic, and they can also be misleading. So it's helpful to have a guideline. The lingua franca core is not a model, it's not an accent, it's not a variety. It's just a set of features which have been shown to be very important for intelligibility, and th is not in it. There's a question here. Do we have time for one more question? Just, I think you might be interested in this, is about, do we have any suggestions or advice for how students can continue working on their pronunciation after a course is over? That's from Prachi Tulshan, watching online. Yeah, well, thanks very much for that question. Yeah, we have got some ideas. One site that's really useful, I found, is the British Council ESOL Nexus site. If you go to the top bar and click on speaking, and then go down and click pronunciation, on there's actually really useful videos where you can see somebody's mouth moving, and it's all about minimal pairs. So, for example, my students' p and b is a classic example in my context. And you can see somebody pronouncing it. Then you can listen to like dictations, small snippets, and then you can practice copying it. And then there are some like tongue twisters on there. So I would really recommend that. I think I put that link on the handout. Yeah. And so in terms of improving your continuing to improve your work on your pronunciation, I think what we talked about with models and looking online for examples of pronunciation that you would like to aspire towards, and then choosing a model to work towards, and listening lots is key, and then imitating. Just short snippets. I think when we talk about listening, often with our students, they think, oh, I have to watch a film. You can just watch a tiny 10-second snippet. And if you want to extract audio off YouTube, so you just want a smaller section, we've actually put directions on our blog post, on one of our blog posts, about how to extract audio. Because one of the issues I had for doing this was that YouTube clips are quite hard to just keep replaying the same tiny snippet again and again and again. You can't get back to exactly the right place. So I think I put a blog post called Film Star Dictations, and at the bottom of that blog post, I put step-by-step directions about how to extract audio into an MP3 file, which means you can then just take the tiny bit you want and just listen again and again. And that's what I would recommend doing. Any more questions?
We have one more question here.
Thank you. My question would be to do with the students' attitude, because I find that very often students expect and sometimes even demand the native speaker norm, and they don't want to learn from each other, and then they state that explicitly. So have you got any advice?
Can I ask what context you teach in?
English as a foreign language.
Here in London?
Yes.
I think it comes back to, we actually didn't talk a lot about attitudes, to be fair, but it's about having the discussion with your students about why they're making the choices they're making. And also, I think, respecting the choices they're making. Because we don't mean to suggest that everybody does need to use English as a lingua franca. And some of them will prefer to strive for native-like pronunciation, and they'll have reasons for that, which they don't want to change. And that's fine, and as a teacher, it's your job to help them do that. But I think if they've made that choice based on information about how the language is used and what alternatives are available, then I can respect that choice a little bit more, as it's clearly informed by some knowledge of why they're making it, if you see what I mean. So it's a long discussion. It's the kind of thing that Katy mentioned, ELF moments. And it's the kind of thing where just every now and again something will happen in a class and you seize on that as an opportunity to ask, well, that's a very good question. How would this person say it? What would you prefer to sound like? Why? Is that going to help you in this context? And so on. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the main messages we would like to put out is that we as teachers cannot assume anything. And I think for a long time there has been an assumption that students want a native speaker model, and so it's not really surprising now that our students are telling us that, because we've been telling them that ourselves as teachers for so long. So at least we could start with our own perspective as a teacher, that we can't assume anything, and then over time, yeah, like with any prejudice, like Richard was talking about, it takes time to erode prejudices.
Okay, that's great. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but Laura and Katy are going to stay with us, hopefully. So here in the room, please stick around, and perhaps you'll have a chance to catch them. And for those of you online, Katy and Laura also wrote a blog post on the British Council Voices blog, so if you have any further questions, perhaps comment there, and then maybe if you'd like to have a look. And likewise, Laura and Katy have the elfpron.wordpress.com blog, which sounds like it has some fantastic resources, so I'd encourage you to go there.